There are one or two themes in this novel which I developed because they surprised me when I learned about them. And one theme, it doesn't seem to be so extraordinary now, but it did surprise me, was that the Germans during the First World War were completely unprepared for collapse, for defeat. They believed their own propaganda. They were convinced, the German public, the German military, the politicians, and the general staff were certain that they were going to win that war. And they financed the war out of their own resources. They did not borrow from the Americans, as the British did, and certainly the French. They had the money, or they borrowed from the public. They financed the war by themselves, knowing they financed the war out of their own resources on the assumption, on the certainty that the reparations they would impose on the French and the English and the Americans, that they would be paid back, that the war would be self-financing. They were unprepared, totally unprepared. So it's incredible how kind of self-hypnosis, they couldn't believe it when after the spring offensive in 1918, which was the last great effort which the Germans made in northern France. They had already defeated the Tsarist army, which were threatening to invade East Prussia. And they were sure that the great offensive, the spring offensive of 1918, would finally end the war in triumph. And when by October, this was not so, the military collapsed. They did not know. Ludendorff, there were two dictators, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The Kaiser was no longer, they shoved him aside. He was a rich ceremonial figurehead. The war was carried out by these two men, kind of dictators, and Ludendorff lost his head, had a nervous breakdown, and then was deposed. And Hindenburg carried on. And they're totally unprepared. So that's one of the things that is kind of surprising. One would have thought that anybody, any power at war must, at the back of their mind, think, it may go wrong. But at the back of the German mind, in 1914 to 1918, there was no such thought, apparently, except for a bunch of liberals, or whatever you want to call them, who were pacifists. There were not that many, but there were some. Okay, that's one thing. I deal with this in some detail, and because it seemed to be very surprising. And the point is that because Hindenburg and the rest of the officers in the general staff, because they lost their heads, they gave in too soon. There was no military necessity as yet in October 1918, and then in the armistice in November 1918. They overdid it. They could have admitted defeat without capitulating, and they could have then negotiated. Their troops were inside France, 60 miles out of Paris. The Zeppelins were bombing London. They were still militarily in quite a strong position, in spite of having lost the offense. But they lost their heads and gave in, and the result was Versailles, and they had no bargaining position left at all. Okay, that's one point. And the other thing that's of some interest is Hitler, who was not a figure in the 1920s of any real importance. But I deal with him. he was a figure in 1923, just for a few weeks. In 1923 in Munich, he tried a putsch. A putsch is a lovely word, P-U-T-S-C-H. He tried to take over the government in the beer halls of Munich. And I deal with this in the form, since music is so important in this book, I deal with it as though it was an operetta, a comic operetta. I deal with it as though it was, you've all seen guides to opera. I deal with it like a synopsis of a amusing, funny operetta, because it was an extraordinary event. Had it not been so serious, one could not have believed it. In a beer hall, of all places, Hitler jumped on a table, declared, I'm taking over the government. And he had captive for a few hours 2 or 3 very important people in Bavaria, and he had the stormtroopers, and Goering and others were there, other people who then later played a very important regime, played a part in the regime. And they took over the government until that collapsed, and Hitler was arrested, and he was tried, and one of those judges, my friend Hermann, gave him an extremely lenient sentence, and he had a very soft time in a fortress, in a fortress. It was a penitentiary, but it wasn't it was a soft prison, and he was treated by the personnel of the prison, by the guards, as a distinguished guest. He was allowed all kinds of privileges. He held court, birthday celebrations. The sentence was very quickly commuted to, I've forgotten, a few months, maybe a year. And during that time, he dictated Mein Kampf, his great book, which became the Bible of Nazism. All this, and I deal with this, and a particularly amusing, in a kind of horrible way, figure in all this was Putzi Hanfstengel, who is Putzi. Putzi is a funny name in German and in English, Putzi, who is an interesting figure who became a friend of Hitler's. He was, on his mother's side, he was the grandson of his mother was American. He was the grandson, or she was the granddaughter of a Civil War general. And on his father's side, Hanfstengel, a very well-known company still exists of art reproductions in Munich. And during the First World War, he was in New York. He was American, half American. And he was never interned during the First World War. He conducted the business of art reproductions in New York during the First World War. And then afterwards, he went to Munich after 1918, and he met Hitler in a beer hall in 1919. And you see, Hitler had been a nobody before the First World War. He was a nobody during the First World War. And during the spring offensive, which I just mentioned, in 1918, in the summer of 1918, he was the victim of a gas attack by the British in northern France. And he was blinded, very unpleasant. And he was taken to a hospital, field hospital, sanatorium or something, east of Berlin, near the Polish border. And during the late summer and fall and early winter of 1918, he was out of it. He was in that hospital, blinded. And when he regained his sight, and when he was released from the hospital, he went to Munich, where he'd come from. The war, the collapse of Germany, the war came to an end while Hitler was not conscious. And he did not, therefore, witness the end of the war. And he could therefore say the war never did end. And for him the war did not end. And the fact that there seemed to be an armistice of some sort, he was due to the stab in the back. The stab in the back. We Germans, well, he was an Austrian, but never mind. We were stabbed in the back by socialists, liberals, and Jews. So, and then you see, then it's that frame of mind. After he went to the music, to the beer halls of Munich, and he met Puzzi. And his oratory was so extraordinary, so hypnotic. He mesmerized the people in the beer hall, among others Puzzi, who then took him home to his palatial house. He met the mother, he met the father, he met them, and they then took him in hand and taught him table manners, how to dress properly, how to have clean fingernails, etc., to make him, to kind of groom him for a civilized existence. And that was the role of Puzzi, Hanfstengel, a historic figure of some interest.